There exists, preserved in the archives of Charleston County, South Carolina, a single-page court document dating from March 1848. It is water-stained and has been deliberately left unfinished, stopping abruptly mid-sentence. The testimony of 9 deceased cannot be admitted as their deaths occurred under circumstances the court finds. The rest has been carefully excised with a blade. These final legible words appear. For generations, local historians avoided this document entirely. Those few who did examine it noticed something peculiar. 9 death certificates were filed within a span of 72 hours, all listing the same plantation as place of death, all bearing an identical physician's signature, all recording the same single word as cause. Executed. In the plantation ledgers from that same period, 9 names are crossed through in red ink on March 14, 1848. 9 men who, according to every official channel, simply stopped existing. What crime could possibly have justified such swift, coordinated elimination? What testimony was considered so dangerous that it required silencing before it could even be spoken aloud? The answer lies not in what these 9 men did, but in what they knew about the woman who resided in the manor house and the baron who held ownership over them all. Before we continue with the story of Ashbourne Plantation and the trial that was never completed, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this, stories meant to remain buried, this is precisely what we uncover here. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? I want to know how far this story reaches. What made this case particularly unsettling to those who encountered it wasn't the execution itself. Extrajudicial killings of enslaved individuals, though horrific, were tragically routine in the antebellum South. What disturbed them was the precision. 9 men. Not 8, not 10. That specificity suggested calculation, not rage. It suggested a secret that required exactly 9 deaths to contain. Ashbourne Plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of South Carolina low country, situated 12 miles inland from Charleston proper, where the Ashley River widened into marshland and the air hung thick with salt and decay even during winter. The estate was established in 1789 by the Vanderhoorn family, Dutch traders who had accumulated their wealth in indigo before shifting to cotton as market demands shifted. By 1845, when Baron Wilhelm Vanderhoorn inherited the property from his uncle, Ashbourne was regarded as one of the more progressive plantations in the area, a designation that meant very little beyond slightly improved food rations and fewer public whippings. Wilhelm Vanderhoorn was not born bearing the title of Baron. He purchased it in 1843 during a journey through the fragmenting German states, a vanity acquisition that nevertheless carried legal weight in certain European circles and added a veneer of aristocratic legitimacy to his status as a southern planter. He was 37 when he inherited Ashbourne, a man of medium build with pale eyes that watered in bright sunlight and hands that trembled slightly when he believed no one was watching, a tremor that had intensified since his return from a Berlin sanatorium in 1844, where he had been treated for what his correspondents vaguely termed nervous exhaustion. The Baron arrived at Ashbourne in April 1845 accompanied by a wife. Margarita Vanderhoorn was 23, the daughter of a Bremen merchant whose shipping business had collapsed during the economic upheavals of the 1840s. Intermediaries had brokered the marriage. Wilhelm and Margarita had met exactly twice before their wedding day. Plantation records document her arrival with unusual specificity. She brought with her 7 trunks, 2 ladies' maids, both German, both dismissed within 6 months and sent back to Europe, and a personal physician named Dr. Ernst Keller, who remained at Ashbourne continuously until the events of March 1848. Margarita was, according to all contemporary accounts, beautiful, pale-skinned, dark-haired, possessing the kind of fragile delicacy that Southern society mistook for refinement. But she was also sickly. She suffered from what the Baron's correspondents termed womanly complaints, likely endometriosis or chronic pelvic inflammation, conditions that the medicine of that era could neither accurately diagnose nor effectively treat. She spent days confined to her chambers, attended by Dr. Keller, who administered laudanum and various herbal tinctures that left her drowsy and compliant. But the Baron's obsession was not with his wife's health. It was with her fertility, or rather, the absence thereof. Ashbourne Plantation operated with approximately 130 enslaved individuals in 1845. Among them, 9 men worked in what plantation records euphemistically designated as house service, maintenance, groundskeeping, and personal service to the Vanderhorn household. These 9 men ranged in age from 19 to 34. They were selected not for agricultural skill but for physical attributes, height, build, health, and what one inventory list coldly categorized as breeding quality. This was not unusual. Enslaved people were routinely evaluated as livestock. What was unusual was the Baron's specific interest in these 9, documented in his personal ledgers with measurements, health assessments, and lineage tracking suggesting he was maintaining breeding records. The 9 men were Thomas Ridley, age 28, born on the plantation to parents sold away when he was 7. Marcus Finch, age 23, purchased from a Virginia estate in 1844, literate despite laws prohibiting it. Isaiah Brennan, age 31, a blacksmith's apprentice with distinctive scarring on his hands from forge work. Daniel Pute, age 26, formerly of a Savannah household, sold south after his previous owner's bankruptcy. Jacob Worth, age 22, born in Charleston, the son of a German immigrant who died in debt, resulting in his enslavement. Samuel Hoyt, age 34, the oldest, who had attempted escape twice and bore the scars of punishment. Levi Church, age 29, a carpenter who had constructed several of the plantation's outbuildings. Nathaniel Cross, age 25, who worked the stables and could calm even the most anxious horses. Robert Foster, aged 19, the youngest, who had been at Ashbourne only 8 months. These men existed in the peculiar purgatory of house slaves, better fed and clothed than field workers, but subjected to closer scrutiny and more intimate forms of exploitation. They lived in a separate quarter near the main house, not in the field cabins. They ate better food. They wore livery when serving in the main house. And they understood that their proximity to power made them simultaneously privileged and endangered. The white community surrounding Ashbourne in 1845 was small and insular. The nearest neighboring plantation, Brickyard Estate, lay 4 miles east. The town of Middleton, barely a town at all, just a church, a general store, a blacksmith, and perhaps 30 families, sat 6 miles north. Charleston, with its society and scrutiny, felt much farther away than 12 miles when the roads were poor. This isolation was intentional. Planters preferred distance from prying eyes, even the eyes of their peers. The social architecture of the region was rigid. White planters maintained elaborate fictions of honor, chivalry, and paternalism while profiting from the systematic brutalization of human beings. White women, particularly those of the planter class, were placed on pedestals that were really just gilded cages, expected to be decorative, obedient, and above all, fertile. Producing heirs was not merely a personal matter. It was an economic and social imperative. Inheritance laws, property consolidation, and family prestige all depended on legitimate male offspring. This was the world Wilhelm Vanderhorn inhabited, a world where his worth as a man was measured partly by his ability to produce an heir, and where his wife's failure to conceive reflected on both of them with increasing social urgency. By the fall of 1847, after 2.5 years of marriage, Margarita had not become pregnant. The Baron's correspondence from this period, preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society archives though carefully redacted in places, reveals growing desperation. Letters to physicians in Charleston, Baltimore, even one to a specialist in Philadelphia, all asking the same question: what could be done about a barren wife? The responses, when they existed, recommended the usual remedies: dietary changes, less laudanum, more rest, less rest, prayer, patent medicines. One Philadelphia doctor suggested the problem might lie with the husband, a notion the Baron rejected with fury so intense his reply letter was excluded from his own papers, preserved only because the recipient kept it as a curiosity. Then, in December 1847, something changed. The overseer's logs from Ashbourne, perfunctory records of work assignments and discipline, show an unusual notation. On December 18th, Baron's orders, 9 housemen reassigned to manor service exclusively. No field work until further notice. The 9 men had been separated from the general population of the enslaved community. The winter of 1847–48 was mild in the low country. Temperatures rarely dropped below 40 even at night. The marshlands didn't freeze, they simply grew quieter, the usual chorus of insects and frogs dampened by the season's chill. At Ashbourne, smoke rose perpetually from the manor house chimneys, and lights burned in the upper windows long after decent hours. It was during this winter that the 9 men began to disappear from common view. Thomas Ridley was the first. On December 20th, he was summoned to the main house in the evening. Unusual, but not unprecedented. House slaves were often called at odd hours. What was unprecedented was that he didn't return to the quarters that night, or the next night. When he finally reappeared 3 days later, he was silent. Not quiet. Silent in the way of someone who has witnessed something that language cannot capture. The other enslaved people noticed. They noticed how he moved differently, how he wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, how he flinched when the Baron's name was mentioned. Marcus Finch was next, summoned on December 27th, then Isaiah Brennan on January 3rd. One by one through January and into February, each of the 9 men was called to the manor house for periods ranging from 2 to 5 days. When they returned, they were changed. Some bore marks, not the marks of whipping, but bruises in strange places, scratches, the kinds of injuries that suggested struggle or restraint. But they didn't speak of it, not to each other, and certainly not to anyone else. The enslaved community at Ashbourne developed theories whispered in the fields and the quarters. Some thought the Baron was conducting medical experiments. There were rumors of such things happening on other plantations where enslaved people were used as subjects for surgical practice or disease testing. Others thought it was some kind of punishment, though none of the 9 had committed any offense. Still others believed it was sexual exploitation, which was so common as to be almost unremarkable, though usually directed at enslaved women, not men. But there was something else, something that didn't fit the usual patterns of plantation horror. The Baron's wife had begun to appear in public again. Margarita Vanderhorn, who had spent most of 1846 and 1847 confined to her chambers, emerged in late January 1848. She attended church services in Middleton, rode in the Baron's carriage to call on neighboring plantation families, appeared at a dinner party at Brickyard Estate in early February. Women who saw her remarked on her improved health, her better color. Some noted that she looked almost radiant, a word several used independently in letters and diary entries preserved from that period. But she also looked haunted. Sarah Prescott, the wife of a neighboring planter, wrote to her sister in Charleston in February 1848, saw Mrs. Vanderhorn at the Brickyard dinner. She looked well in body, but strange in demeanor. When complimented on her improved health, she smiled in a manner that put me in mind of someone acting a part in a play. She kept looking toward her husband as though seeking permission to speak. And once, when I mentioned my own children, she gripped my hand so tightly I thought she might bruise me. She said nothing, only held my hand and stared at me with eyes that seemed to be pleading something I could not understand. By late February, the truth was spreading through the enslaved quarters in whispers that barely qualified as sound. The 9 men, over weeks of isolation and horror, had been ordered to perform an unspeakable task. Not ordered as one might order a work duty, but ordered in the absolute way that defined the master-slave relationship, ordered under threat of death, ordered with the full weight of legal and physical power that allowed a planter to do literally anything to the people he owned. The Baron had commanded each of the 9 men in sequence to impregnate his wife. The horror of this wasn't just in the act itself, though that was profound enough, forcing enslaved men to commit what would be framed as rape under any other circumstance while simultaneously forcing his wife into sexual encounters she had no ability to refuse. The horror was in the calculation of it. The Baron had reasoned with a logic that could only emerge from the grotesque moral inversions of slavery, that if his wife could not conceive with him, the problem must lie with him, not her. And if the problem was his, then the solution was to use other men. Men he owned. Men who could be compelled and then disposed of. Men whose children would legally be his property regardless of biological paternity. He had created a system where 9 men would be violated, his wife would be violated, and the resulting child, if there was one, would belong to him in every legal sense, while the truth could be erased by simply killing everyone who knew it. Dr. Keller, the German physician who had accompanied Margarita from Bremen, facilitated this horror. Correspondence found later suggests he may have even suggested it, based on his readings of agricultural breeding practices applied to humans. He monitored Margarita's monthly cycles, determined her fertile periods, and scheduled the encounters accordingly. He was present during them, ostensibly for medical supervision, which meant he witnessed and documented acts of systematic rape orchestrated by his employer. The 9 men had no choice. When Thomas Ridley initially refused, he had been taken to the cellar and shown the instruments that would be used on him if he continued to refuse, not instruments of simple beating, but of mutilation. He was given a choice between rape and castration. Each of the 9 men was given this choice in sequence. Each of them, confronted with that choice, chose survival. Margarita, according to fragments of Dr. Keller's notes that survived, was heavily sedated during the encounters. She was conscious enough to comply but drugged enough to be compliant, a state of pharmacologically induced docility that the Baron and Dr. Keller apparently believed absolved them of the additional crime of forcing her to consciously participate in the destruction of her own marriage and dignity. By early March 1848, Margarita Vanderhorn was pregnant. Dr. Keller confirmed it on March 8. His notation in his medical journal, preserved because it was in German and later overlooked by those who cleaned out the plantation records, reads, "Conception confirmed. 6th week. All protocols followed. Patient responsive to pregnancy. Employer satisfied. Disposal protocols to commence immediately." Disposal protocols. The Baron had always intended to kill them. All 9. The moment pregnancy was confirmed, the men who could identify the child's true paternity became liabilities that had to be eliminated. On March 12, 1848, the 9 men were summoned together for the first time since the nightmare had begun. They were brought to the manor house's ground floor parlor, a room they had cleaned and maintained but were never permitted to occupy. The Baron stood before them, Dr. Keller beside him, and delivered what he apparently believed was good news. "Gentlemen," he said, a word he had never used for enslaved men before, a word that should have warned them. "You have served this household with distinction. You will be rewarded." The reward, he explained, was freedom. Manumission papers had been prepared. Each man would be freed, given $20 in cash, and transported by wagon to Charleston, where they could begin their lives as free men. They would leave the following morning, March 13th. They should prepare themselves. The 9 men knew he was lying. They knew because they understood the fundamental truth of their existence. They were witnesses to something the Baron could never allow to be spoken. They knew because several of them were literate enough to understand that freeing 9 healthy enslaved men simultaneously represented a financial loss the Baron would never accept. They knew because they had seen his eyes during the winter months, the cold calculation of a man who viewed human beings as problems to be solved, not lives to be valued. Marcus Finch, who could read and write despite laws forbidding it, later told a story that never made it into any official record but circulated through the enslaved communities of the Low Country for decades. He said that on the night of March 12, as the 9 men sat together in their quarters waiting for morning, they discussed running. They knew the swamps, knew the routes north, knew which free black communities might shelter them. They discussed it seriously, calculating odds and distances. But they also knew that running would confirm guilt. Guilt of something, even if the Baron had to invent the crime. Running would trigger pursuit, and pursuit in South Carolina in 1848 meant dogs, patrols, and violence that would extend beyond the runaways to everyone they had ever known. Plantation owners used collective punishment as a control mechanism. If these 9 ran, others at Ashbourne would suffer for it. So they made a different decision. They decided to testify. The conversation that night, as reported decades later by those who heard it from survivors, centered on a dangerous question: what if they told the truth, not to the Baron, but to authorities? What if they went to Charleston and found a magistrate, a lawyer, someone in the legal system who might listen? It was a desperate plan born of desperation. Enslaved people had almost no standing in Southern courts, but almost none wasn't, absolutely none. There were rare cases, very rare, where testimony from enslaved people had been admitted, particularly in cases involving white victims or crimes that threatened the social order. And this crime did threaten the social order. The Baron hadn't just raped his slaves, he had used them to rape his wife. He had corrupted the sanctity of white womanhood, the cornerstone fiction of Southern society. If that came to light, it would be a scandal that could destroy even a man of his wealth and title. The 9 men reasoned that if they could reach Charleston together, if they could tell their story in a public way that made it impossible to ignore, they might survive. The Baron couldn't kill them on the streets of Charleston without consequences. He couldn't make 9 free men disappear in a city without questions being asked. It was a terrible plan, dependent on systems and institutions that had shown themselves to be fundamentally hostile to black testimony, but it was the only plan they had. They were scheduled to leave for Charleston at dawn on March 13th. They never made it to the wagon. At approximately 4 o'clock in the morning on March 13, 1848, while the plantation still slept and the sky was that particular purple-black that comes just before dawn, 7 white men arrived at Ashbourne Plantation on horseback. They came from Middleton and from Brickyard Estate, planters and their adult sons, men who were the Baron's peers and in some cases his friends. They had been summoned the previous evening by urgent messages delivered by the Baron's personal courier. The messages, which no longer exist but were referenced in later correspondence, apparently spoke of a plot. A slave rebellion, the messages claimed. 9 men planning to murder the family and burn the plantation. The Baron had discovered the plot, the messages said, through an informant. He needed help containing the situation before dawn, when the conspirators planned to strike. This narrative, slave rebellion plots, was the ultimate fear of every plantation owner, the nightmare that justified their most extreme violence. Whether the 7 men who responded to the Baron's call believed the story or merely agreed to participate in something they understood was a fiction didn't matter. They came. They came armed. The 9 men were dragged from their quarters before sunrise. Not arrested, slavery didn't require arrest. Not charged, slavery didn't require charges. They were simply taken, bound, and brought to an area behind the main house where the property sloped down toward the marshland, and 3 live oak trees stood in a rough triangle, their branches spreading wide and strong enough to support weight. What happened next was execution as performance, execution as social ritual. This wasn't hidden violence in a cellar. It was public, deliberate, and witnessed. The other enslaved people at Ashbourne were forced to watch. This, too, was standard practice. Public punishment served as warnings, as demonstrations of power, as reminders of what happened to those who stepped out of line. But something went wrong with the Baron's script. As the ropes were being prepared, Thomas Ridley began to shout. Not pleas for mercy, those were expected and usually ignored. He shouted testimony. He shouted the truth about what had been done to them, about the Baron's wife, about the pregnancy, about the systematic rape orchestrated by the men who now claimed they had plotted rebellion. The other 8 joined him. They shouted over each other, their voices carrying across the plantation in the dawn air. They named dates, described the room where it happened, described Dr. Keller's presence, described Margarita's drug compliance. They made sure everyone heard. The enslaved people watching heard. The 7 white men who had come to help heard. And somewhere in the manor house, windows closed abruptly as Margarita heard her violation shouted for the world to know. The Baron's response was to accelerate the executions. The historical record becomes fragmentary here, which is itself telling. No official report was filed. The local sheriff based in Middleton was informed after the fact and made a notation in his log. Baron Vanderhorn reports suppression of slave rebellion at Ashbourne. 9 conspirators executed. No white casualties. Matter resolved. That's it. That's the entire official documentation of 9 men's deaths. But other evidence exists. Letters between planters in the weeks following March 13 contain oblique references to the situation at Vanderhorn's place and questions about whether such measures were necessary. One letter from a Charleston lawyer named Edmund Berkeley to his brother, a planter in Georgia, dated March 20, 1848, is more explicit. The Vanderhorn affair has created considerable disquiet. The manner of it was public enough to generate talk, and the claims made by the deceased, while preposterous on their face given the source, are salacious enough to have achieved some circulation. Several families have declined social invitations from the Baron. I am told his wife has taken to her chambers and will receive no visitors. The 9 men were buried in unmarked graves somewhere on Ashbourne property. Plantation records show the burial location as South Marsh Boundary, a designation that covered several hundred acres of wetland. No markers were placed. No minister officiated. They were erased as thoroughly as the Baron could manage, but their testimony had been heard. The enslaved community at Ashbourne now knew the full truth. So did enslaved people on neighboring plantations, because information traveled through networks that white society barely understood existed. Conversations at market. Messages passed through interplantation visits. Stories told by those who had witnessed the executions and later encountered people from other places. Within days, the story was circulating through the Low Country's black communities. Within weeks, it had reached Charleston. And in Charleston, something unexpected happened. A free black woman named Ruth Denny, who worked as a seamstress and had connections to both the free black community and to several abolition-sympathetic white families, heard the story from her cousin, who had heard it from someone who had been at Ashbourne the morning of the executions. Ruth Denny did something extraordinary. She wrote it down. Not just the basic facts, but a detailed account, including names, dates, and the testimony the 9 men had shouted as they died. Then she brought it to a lawyer. Edmund Berkeley was 43 years old in 1848, a Charleston lawyer with a respectable practice in property law and estates. He was not an abolitionist, far from it. He owned 2 enslaved people himself, a fact he would later struggle to reconcile with his actions. But he was also a man who believed, perhaps naively, that the law meant something. That even in South Carolina, even in the heart of slavery's power, there were limits to what could be done without consequence. When Ruth Denny appeared at his office on March 25, 1848, he initially refused to see her. Free black people were permitted to engage lawyers for limited purposes, but a woman seeking to bring charges against a white planter on behalf of dead slaves. That was not only unprecedented, it was dangerous. But Ruth Denny didn't leave. She waited outside his office for 3 hours. And when he finally agreed to speak with her, she presented him with something he couldn't dismiss, a written account in careful handwriting of events that, if true, constituted crimes even under South Carolina law. The law was complicated and contradictory. Enslaved people had no rights, but they also weren't entirely without protection under law. Planters couldn't simply murder enslaved people without cause. There had to be at least a pretense of justice, a claim of crime and punishment. The Baron had provided that pretense, rebellion conspiracy. But if the rebellion conspiracy was false, if it could be proven that the 9 men were killed not for plotting against the Baron but for knowledge they possessed, then the Baron had committed murder. 9 counts of it. Moreover, if the story Ruth Denny related was true, the Baron had committed what some courts might consider rape against his own wife. Not a crime under most interpretations of the law, since wives couldn't legally refuse their husbands, but combined with the forced impregnation scheme, it created a moral offense that even pro-slavery society found disturbing. Berkeley agreed to investigate. He did this, he later wrote, not out of any sympathy for enslaved people or opposition to slavery, but because the rule of law must mean something, or we descend into barbarism, which even our peculiar institution must not become. His investigation led him to Ashbourne Plantation in early April 1848. The Baron received him with hostility barely concealed beneath social courtesy. Berkeley, claiming to be following up on routine legal matters related to the estate, asked questions about the executions. The Baron's answers were curt. The slaves had plotted rebellion. He had discovered it. He had acted swiftly to protect his family and property. It was all perfectly legal. The men were his property. He disposed of them as the law allowed. And the testimony they gave as they died. Berkeley asked. The claims about your wife? The Baron's face went blank. Lies of desperate men attempting to sow discord. I give them no credence, and neither should anyone else. Several witnesses heard these claims. Free men, white men, who were present at your request. And every one of them understands that enslaved people will say anything when facing punishment. Their words have no weight. Berkeley then asked to speak with Margarita Vanderhorn. The Baron refused. She was unwell, he said, confined to bed under Dr. Keller's care. She could not receive visitors. She is also a witness to the events in question, Berkeley said carefully. If the slaves' claims were false, her testimony would refute them definitively. My wife, the Baron said, and his voice carried a coldness that Berkeley later described as absolute, will not be subjected to questions about lies told by animals who committed treason against this household. I will not have her name dragged through filth by a legal proceeding that should never exist. If you persist in this, Mr. Berkeley, you will find that men of influence in Charleston have long memories. It was a threat, delivered politely, and it should have ended there. But Berkeley made a crucial discovery. In reviewing public records at the Charleston courthouse, he found something the Baron hadn't anticipated: Dr. Ernst Keller's physician's license application from 1845, which included references and correspondence. Among them was a letter from a Berlin medical facility where Keller had trained. The letter described Keller's particular area of study, applied genetics and breeding optimization in mammalian species, with theoretical extensions to human improvement. Eugenics, before it was called eugenics. The medical pseudoscience that would later explode into full horror in the next century, but which already existed in embryonic form in the 1840s among certain European medical circles. Berkeley also found records of Keller's purchases from Charleston apothecaries, large quantities of laudanum, chloral hydrate, and several other sedatives, far more than would be needed for one patient, unless that patient was being kept perpetually drugged. Armed with this, Berkeley did something extraordinary. He filed a formal complaint with the Charleston County Court, requesting an inquest into the deaths of 9 enslaved people at Ashbourne Plantation on grounds that their execution may have been carried out to conceal crimes committed by Wilhelm Vanderhorn against his wife and against the deceased. The filing of this complaint on April 18, 1848, created an immediate scandal. Charleston society divided sharply. Some planters were outraged that one of their own was being questioned on the word of enslaved people and a free black woman. Others, particularly those with daughters or wives, found the allegations disturbing enough to warrant investigation. Not out of concern for the enslaved men, but out of concern for what it might mean if planters could do such things to white women with impunity. The court, under pressure, agreed to hold a preliminary hearing. Not a trial. Enslaved people couldn't testify in trials against white people, but a hearing to determine if sufficient evidence existed to warrant further investigation. The hearing was scheduled for May 2, 1848. The Baron hired 3 lawyers. He mobilized every social and political connection he had. He sent letters to newspaper editors, to ministers, to fellow planters, all making the same argument: this hearing was an attack on property rights, on the fundamental order of Southern society, on the sanctity of a man's right to manage his household and his property without interference. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror at Ashbourne intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let us discover together what happens next. The night before the hearing, someone broke into Edmund Berkeley's office and destroyed his files on the case. The written account Ruth Denny had provided was stolen. The documents he had gathered from apothecary records were burned. Only copies he had made and stored at his home survived. The same night, Ruth Denny disappeared. She was never seen again. Her disappearance was never investigated. Free black people went missing in southern cities with disturbing regularity, and authorities rarely expended effort finding them. And at Ashbourne Plantation, Margarita Vanderhorn went into premature labor. The hearing on May 2, 1848, lasted less than 4 hours. Edmund Berkeley appeared with what remained of his evidence. The Baron appeared with his 3 lawyers and 7 witnesses, the same 7 men who had participated in the executions. Each of them testified that they had responded to the Baron's call for help against a rebellion conspiracy, that they had witnessed the slaves' threatening behavior, and that the execution had been necessary for public safety. They acknowledged that the 9 men had shouted various claims during the execution but characterized these as desperate lies. The courtroom itself was packed beyond capacity. The Charleston County Courthouse, a 3-story brick building on Meeting Street, had a main chamber that could comfortably seat perhaps 80 people. On May 2, nearly 200 crowded inside, planters and their wives, merchants, lawyers, a handful of free black people who stood in the back where they were permitted, and several newspaper correspondents from as far away as Richmond and Baltimore. The air was stifling despite the open windows, thick with the smell of sweat, tobacco, and the perfumes wealthy women wore to mask less pleasant odors. Judge Samuel Winthrop presided from an elevated bench of dark mahogany, his white hair carefully combed, his black robes immaculate despite the heat. He was known as a fair man within the narrow confines of what fair meant in South Carolina in 1848, which is to say he followed the law as written, and the law as written protected property above all else. The Baron's lead attorney, Clayton Merrick, was 56 years old and had defended planters in similar cases for 3 decades. He was tall, silver-haired, with a voice that carried authority and contempt in equal measure. His opening statement lasted 40 minutes and focused entirely on property rights. This hearing, he said, pacing before the judge's bench, is predicated on a dangerous precedent that a man's management of his own property, his lawful, documented property, can be questioned based on the dying words of criminals caught in conspiracy. If we allow this, gentlemen, where does it end? Can any slave facing punishment simply accuse his master of invented crimes and expect the courts to grant credence? The fabric of our society depends on order, and order depends on the authority of property holders to manage their holdings without interference based on the word of cattle. Edmund Berkeley's counterargument was more measured, more careful. He stood at a simple wooden table, his remaining documents spread before him, and spoke for perhaps 20 minutes. This court is not being asked to take the word of enslaved people over that of a white planter. This court is being asked to examine whether the circumstances surrounding 9 simultaneous executions suggest crimes that warranted those executions, or crimes that motivated them. I have evidence, incomplete due to recent theft and destruction, that suggests Baron Vanderhorn orchestrated a scheme that violated not just moral law but the boundaries of acceptable conduct even within our peculiar institution. Evidence that indicates the rebellion conspiracy was fabricated after the fact to justify executions planned in advance. What evidence? Judge Winthrop asked. Berkeley presented what he had. Copies of apothecary records showing Dr. Keller's purchases of sedatives in quantities far exceeding normal medical practice. A deposition from a Charleston merchant who had sold the Baron 9 sets of iron restraints in January 1848. Not the usual plantation restraints used for punishment or control of field workers, but smaller restraints, the kind used in medical or psychiatric facilities. Testimony from a free black carpenter named Moses Green, who had been hired to install heavy locks on the interior of a ground-floor room at Ashbourne in December 1847, locks that secured from the outside. These are circumstantial fragments, Merrick objected. They prove nothing except that a household purchased medical supplies and made security improvements. They establish a pattern, Berkeley countered. A pattern of preparation for something that required sedation, physical restraint, and containment, combined with the testimony, yes, the testimony of enslaved men, which I acknowledge cannot be admitted as evidence under our law, but which was heard by multiple witnesses, including the 7 gentlemen present today. It suggests a coordinated effort to use enslaved men for purposes that had nothing to do with rebellion and everything to do with the Baron's private obsessions. The 7 witnesses were called one by one. Each told essentially the same story. They had received urgent messages from the Baron on the evening of March 12 describing a rebellion plot. They had responded as neighbors and fellow planters would, arriving before dawn to help suppress the threat. They had witnessed the 9 men being brought out, witnessed their execution, and heard their shouted claims. What exactly did they claim? Berkeley asked during his cross-examination of James Hartwell, a planter from Brickyard Estate. Hartwell shifted uncomfortably. He was 42, thick-necked with hands scarred from years of plantation management. They claimed the Baron had forced them to be with Mrs. Vanderhorn. For breeding purposes. They claimed it was done over weeks under threat and that the Baron planned to kill them to hide it. And what was your reaction to these claims? I thought they were lies. Desperate lies from men facing punishment. Did you ask the Baron about them? Hartwell hesitated. Later. Privately. He said they were fabrications, attempts to create scandal. Did you believe him? Another hesitation. I had no reason not to. Had you ever heard of such a scheme being attempted before? A planter using enslaved men to impregnate his wife. Objection, Merrick called. The question requires speculation about crimes that haven't been proven. I'll rephrase, Berkeley said. Mr. Hartwell, in your experience as a planter, Have you ever heard of breeding schemes involving enslaved people and white women? No, Hartwell admitted. Never. Because such a scheme would be not just immoral but socially catastrophic, wouldn't it? It would violate every principle of racial hierarchy and white female purity that our society claims to uphold. Objection. Counsel is making speeches, not asking questions. Sustained, Judge Winthrop said. Mr. Berkeley, confine yourself to relevant questions. Berkeley moved to his most important witness, a woman named Catherine Mills, who had been Dr. Keller's housekeeper at his Charleston residence before he moved permanently to Ashbourne. She was elderly, white, respectable, the kind of witness whose testimony carried weight. Mrs. Mills testified that Dr. Keller had kept extensive journals, which he had worked on late into the night. I saw them sometimes when I brought him tea, she said. Medical notes, he called them. But once I saw a page open on his desk. It had drawings, human figures with measurements and breeding charts like you would see in agricultural texts about livestock. I asked him about it and he closed the book very quickly. Told me it was research for a theoretical paper. Did he ever discuss his work at Ashbourne Plantation? Only once. He had been drinking. Dr. Keller didn't usually drink, but that night in January, he did. He said he was part of something important. An experiment that would prove his theories about controlled heredity. He said the Baron was a visionary willing to do what others wouldn't dare. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. Hearsay, Merrick objected. And the testimony of a domestic servant regarding private conversations. Mrs. Mills is a free white woman of good standing, Berkeley responded. Her testimony is admissible. Judge Winthrop allowed it but noted that it was circumstantial and interpretive. No enslaved people testified. South Carolina law prohibited it in cases involving white defendants. But their absence was conspicuous, a gap in the proceeding that Berkeley made sure to reference repeatedly. We cannot hear from the men who were executed. We cannot hear from the enslaved people at Ashbourne who witnessed their masters' actions over those winter months. We are forced to reconstruct truth from fragments and from the testimony of those the law permits to speak, which creates a convenient shield for those who commit crimes against people who have no legal voice. At 11:30 in the morning, after 2 hours of testimony, Dr. Ernst Keller stood up. He had been sitting in the back of the courtroom behind the Baron's legal team, virtually unnoticed. He was a small man, narrow-shouldered with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that caught the light from the windows. He wore a dark suit that was slightly too large, as though he had lost weight recently. I have information relevant to these proceedings. The Baron's lawyers immediately moved to stop him. Clayton Merrick half rose from his chair. Your Honor, Dr. Keller is not a scheduled witness. Whatever he intends to say, I am a physician with direct knowledge of the events in question, Keller said, his voice stronger than his appearance suggested. I have medical records that document treatments, conditions, and actions taken at Ashbourne Plantation from 1845 to the present. I request permission to testify. Judge Winthrop studied him for a long moment. You understand that anything you say may be used against your employer? I understand. And you understand that violating physician-patient confidentiality can result in professional consequences? I understand. I also understand that 9 men are dead, and their deaths are on my conscience as much as anyone's. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with conversation, went silent. Very well, Judge Winthrop said. Approach the witness stand. What Keller said over the next 45 minutes was recorded by 3 different court reporters and later cross-referenced. The accounts match almost perfectly, which suggests either extraordinary accuracy or coordination, though given the explosive nature of the testimony, accuracy seems more likely. Keller began by establishing his credentials, trained in Berlin, specialized in reproductive medicine and what he called hereditary science, the study of how traits passed from parents to children. He had been hired by Margarita's father in 1845, specifically to address her reproductive difficulties, which were never clearly diagnosed but presented as chronic pelvic inflammation that made conception unlikely. When I arrived in South Carolina with Mrs. Vanderhorn, Keller testified, I believed my role would be therapeutic, to treat her condition, improve her health, and hopefully enable her to conceive naturally. The Baron, however, had different interests. What interests? Berkeley asked. He was obsessed with heredity. He had read European texts on animal breeding and believed the same principles could be applied to humans. He wanted an heir, but he had doubts about himself, about his capacity to father healthy children. He believed his family line carried weaknesses. There was insanity in his background, a cousin who died in an asylum, an uncle with severe melancholia. He feared passing these weaknesses to offspring. So what did he propose? Keller removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly, a gesture that seemed designed to give him time to gather courage. In late 1845, he asked me if it would be theoretically possible to impregnate his wife using another man's seed. Not through direct contact, he found that idea repellent, but through medical intervention. I told him it was theoretically possible, but ethically unthinkable. He asked me to consider it anyway, to research methods. And did you? I did. I convinced myself it was purely theoretical, academic curiosity. But in 1846, the Baron's requests became more specific. He wanted to know if his wife could be made temporarily infertile through chemical means, then made fertile again when desired. He wanted control over conception. Why would he want that? Because he was planning something. Something he needed time to prepare. He asked me to administer compounds that would prevent conception, not permanently, but reliably. Herbal preparations. Certain chemicals. I did this, God forgive me, for nearly a year. I told Mrs. Vanderhorn I was treating her inflammation. She trusted me. The Baron, sitting at the defendant's table, had gone pale. His lawyers were whispering urgently to him, but he sat motionless, staring at Keller with an expression that several observers later described as murderous. In December 1847, Keller continued, the Baron revealed his full plan. He had selected 9 enslaved men based on physical and mental characteristics he considered superior. He intended to use them in sequence to impregnate his wife while she was sedated. The child would be legally his, genetically improved according to his theories, and the men would be eliminated afterward to ensure secrecy. The courtroom erupted. Judge Winthrop had to gavel for order repeatedly. Several women left the room. 2 planters stood and shouted that this was a fabrication, an abolitionist conspiracy. The Baron's lawyers were on their feet, objecting, demanding Keller be held in contempt, demanding the testimony be struck from the record. Judge Winthrop, visibly shaken, called for a 30-minute recess. When the hearing resumed, Keller was asked to continue. He described the winter of 1847–48 in clinical detail, how each man was brought to a specific room on the ground floor of the manor house, how Margarita was given increasing doses of laudanum and chloral hydrate to keep her in a state of semiconsciousness, how he monitored her cycles to determine optimal timing, how the Baron supervised the entire process. I told myself I was conducting medical research, Keller said, and his voice finally broke. I told myself I was advancing scientific understanding of heredity. But I was facilitating rape. Multiple rapes. I was drugging a woman into compliance and enabling the violation of men who had no choice in the matter. And when Mrs. Vanderhorn conceived in early March, I knew what would happen to those 9 men. I knew, and I said nothing. Why are you saying something now? Berkeley asked. Because they died telling the truth. Because Thomas Ridley looked at me as they put the rope around his neck and said, you know what was done. Because I am complicit in evil that I can no longer pretend was science. And because the Baron plans to do it again. That statement, plans to do it again, caused another uproar. Explain, Judge Winthrop demanded. Mrs. Vanderhorn lost the child. It was stillborn. The Baron blames the stress of the hearing, but I believe it was the cumulative effect of the drugs I had given her over 2 years. He told me 2 weeks ago that we would repeat the procedure, that he would select new men, that we would try again. He said the first attempt was a learning experience, that we would refine the methods. I cannot, participate in that again. The Baron finally spoke. He stood, pushing his lawyers aside, and addressed the court directly. This man is lying. He has fabricated this fantasy to deflect from his own medical incompetence. My wife lost our child due to his negligent treatment, and now he invents this grotesque story to avoid responsibility. I demand he be arrested for perjury and defamation. Do you have the medical records you mentioned? Judge Winthrop asked Keller. I did. I brought them to Charleston yesterday and secured them at my boarding house. When I went to retrieve them this morning to bring to court, they were gone. My room had been entered during the night. The journals were the only items taken. How convenient, Clayton Merrick said. He claims to have evidence but cannot produce it. I have one page, Keller said. He reached into his jacket and removed a folded paper. I kept this separate, in my pocket. It is a single entry from February 1848 documenting Mrs. Vanderhorn's condition and the pregnancy confirmation. It includes details that could only be known by someone with intimate medical access. The page was examined. Judge Winthrop read it, his face growing darker. He showed it to the Baron's lawyers, who consulted hurriedly with their client. Then Judge Winthrop made his ruling, the compromise that would define how this horror was remembered, or rather, forgotten. Dr. Keller's testimony raises serious questions. However, the core issue before this court, the legality of the executions on March 13, remains unchanged. Under South Carolina law, a planter has the right to execute enslaved people who pose a threat to his household. The Baron acted within those rights regarding property he owned. I find no grounds to charge him with crimes related to those 9 deaths. He paused, choosing his words carefully. However, regarding the allegations of crimes against Mrs. Vanderhorn, and regarding Dr. Keller's claims about plans to repeat these alleged actions, I am ordering a separate inquest to be held in closed session with limited participation, to examine Dr. Keller's claims and determine if charges should be brought relating to treatment of a white woman. It was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering. The 9 men's deaths would stand as lawful, but the door was opened slightly, carefully, to investigate the Baron's treatment of his wife. It acknowledged that something terrible had happened without overturning the racial and property hierarchies that the system depended on. The transcript of the hearing ends with this notation, written in the court reporter's careful script: hearing adjourned at 2:47 p.m. Closed inquest scheduled for May 16, 1848. The testimony of 9 deceased cannot be admitted as their deaths occurred under circumstances the court finds, and then it stops. The rest of the page has been carefully removed with a blade, leaving a clean edge where words once existed. Because that night, May 2, 1848, everything that might have led to justice was systematically destroyed. Dr. Ernst Keller left the courthouse and returned to his boarding house on Queen Street. He ate dinner alone in the common room. The landlady remembered this because he had seemed agitated, barely touching his food. He retired to his room at approximately 8 o'clock. At some point during the night, he died. The official report filed by the city coroner listed the cause as heart failure. Keller was 39 years old with no history of cardiac problems. The examination was perfunctory, a visual inspection, no autopsy. The coroner who signed the report, Dr. Marcus Webb, was a regular guest at the Baron's Charleston townhouse and had financial connections to several planter families. Keller's room was found neat, his possessions organized, with one glaring absence: his medical journals, which he had mentioned were stolen, remained missing. Also missing was the single page he had presented in court as evidence. The landlady swore she had heard no disturbance during the night, seen no visitors entering or leaving. Edmund Berkeley's house was burglarized the same night. The break-in occurred between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. while Berkeley was sleeping. He was struck on the head brutally with something heavy and left unconscious in his study. His wife found him at dawn, surrounded by ransacked papers. Every document related to the Ashbourne case was gone. The copies he had made of apothecary records, the depositions, his notes from interviews, all of it taken. The injury to Berkeley's skull fractured his temporal bone and caused bleeding in his brain. Doctors treated him, but he never fully recovered. He suffered severe headaches, memory problems, and a gradual decline that would kill him in 1850. In his lucid moments, he tried to reconstruct the case from memory. But without documentation, without witnesses, without even the transcript that would later be partially destroyed, he had nothing solid to work with. And at Ashbourne Plantation, in the early hours of May 3, Margarita Vanderhorn went into premature labor. She was 6 months pregnant. The child, a boy, was born alive but died within hours. The birth was attended only by a midwife from Middleton, Dr. Keller being dead, and the Baron. No detailed records were kept. The midwife, a woman named Ellen Byers, told her daughter years later that something about that birth had been wrong, that Mrs. Vanderhorn had seemed not just physically devastated but emotionally shattered, that she had refused to look at the infant and had wept, not with the grief of a mother losing a child, but with something else, relief, perhaps, or horror at what the child represented. The coordinated nature of these three events, Keller's death, Berkeley's assault, Margarita's premature labor, was noted by several people at the time. But noting it and proving it were different things. The Baron had been in Charleston for the hearing and had stayed overnight at his townhouse, providing him with an alibi. If he had arranged the attacks, he had done so through intermediaries who were never identified. The closed inquest scheduled for May 16 never happened. With Keller dead and Berkeley incapacitated, there was no one to present evidence. Judge Winthrop quietly canceled the proceeding, noting in his private journal that, pursuing this matter further serves no purpose but to create scandal that damages all parties without possibility of resolution. The court transcript was filed in the Charleston County Archives, where it remained for 6 years until a fire in 1854 destroyed a significant portion of the historical records. The fire was attributed to an overturned lamp, though the night watchman who discovered it swore he had checked that section earlier in the evening and found no lamps burning. The parts of the transcript that survived were those that had been copied by a clerk and stored in a separate location, and even those copies had the final page removed. The infant was buried in the Vanderhorn family cemetery at Ashbourne 3 days after his death, on May 6, 1848. The Baron commissioned a stone from a Charleston mason, white marble, simple, expensive. The inscription read, "Beloved Child. May 3, 1848. May 3, 1848. Too pure for earth." No name was given. The Baron held a brief service, attended only by household staff and a minister from Middleton who read standard funeral prayers without personalizing them. Margarita did not attend. She remained in her chambers, reportedly too grief-stricken to leave her bed. But Ellen Byers, the midwife, later said that when she had checked on Mrs. Vanderhorn the morning after the burial, she had found her sitting by the window staring out at nothing, her face completely blank. She wasn't crying, Byers told her daughter. She wasn't doing anything. She was just empty, like someone had reached inside and removed whatever makes a person alive. The enslaved community at Ashbourne understood what the rest of the world was being encouraged to forget. 9 men had been murdered for knowing the truth, and the truth had died with them, or at least had been buried so deep that it could never be officially acknowledged. But stories don't die just because the powerful want them to. The 9 men's testimony, shouted as they died, had been heard by approximately 70 people, enslaved workers forced to witness the execution, the 7 white planters who had participated, various overseers and drivers. That testimony spread through the networks that connected enslaved communities across the Low Country. The Sunday church gatherings where different plantations' populations met. The market days in Charleston and smaller towns. The nighttime visits between plantations that happened despite restrictions. By the summer of 1848, the story was being told in slave quarters from Georgetown to Beaufort. Details varied. Some versions claimed there were 12 men. Others said the Baron had done this before with different slaves. But the core remained consistent, a Baron who had used enslaved men to impregnate his wife, who had executed them to hide it, and who had gotten away with it because the law valued property rights over human life and white reputation over black testimony. Free black communities heard it, too. Ruth Denny's disappearance had been noted, mourned, and understood for what it was, silencing. But before she vanished, she had told others what she had learned. These stories circulated in Charleston's free black churches, in the mutual aid societies, in the careful conversations that free black people had when they felt safe enough to speak honestly about the horrors surrounding them. Some of these stories were written down. A minister named Reverend Peter Thompson, who served a free black congregation in Charleston, kept a journal that survived through his descendants. An entry from July 1848 reads, "Heard again the story of the 9 men at Ashbourne. Sister Ruth, who brought this testimony to light, has not been seen in 3 months. We fear the worst. The story itself confirms what we have always known, that slavery corrupts everyone it touches, that there is no floor to the degradation it produces, that white society will protect its own no matter what crimes they commit. I pray these men are remembered. I pray their names are not forgotten. Thomas, Marcus, Isaiah, Daniel, Jacob, Samuel, Levi, Nathaniel, Robert. 9 men who told the truth and died for it. Margarita Vanderhorn remained at Ashbourne for 3 more years, but she was a ghost in her own life. Women who visited, and visits became increasingly rare as the scandal's echoes made social calls awkward, reported that she had changed profoundly. Sarah Prescott visited in September 1849 and wrote to her sister, "Saw Mrs. V again. She is quite altered. She speaks very little, and when she does, it is in a flat manner, as though reciting lines learned by rote. She moves through her own house like a guest who had stayed too long. I mentioned the garden, which she once loved, and she looked at me as though I had spoken of a place that existed only in dream. When I mentioned the child, intending sympathy, she looked at me as though I had spoken in a language she didn't recognize, then excused herself and did not return. The Baron joined us for tea and acted as though nothing was amiss. But the house has an atmosphere of wrongness that I cannot adequately describe." Other visitors noted similar things. Margarita had aged dramatically. She was 27 but looked 40. Her hair had begun to gray. She moved slowly, painfully, as though her body hurt constantly. She took laudanum regularly. The Baron claimed it was for her health, but those who knew suspected it was the only way she could endure her existence. She never spoke publicly about what had been done to her. Whether this was because she didn't remember, drugged as she had been throughout the winter of 1847–48, or because she remembered but couldn't bear to acknowledge it, or because she had been threatened into silence, no one knows. Dr. Keller's testimony had suggested she was barely conscious during the assaults, sedated to the point of near unconsciousness. It is possible she never fully understood what had happened to her, or never allowed herself to fully understand it. But her body understood. Her mind understood. And slowly, she faded. In 1851, Margarita contracted what was diagnosed as consumption, tuberculosis. But the diagnosis was made without thorough examination, based mainly on her wasting appearance and persistent cough. Modern medical historians who have reviewed the fragmentary records suggest she may have suffered from severe depression, possibly what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder combined with the long-term effects of chronic opiate use. Her death on November 14, 1851, at age 29, was attributed to consumption, but the speed of her decline suggests she may have simply given up, stopped eating, stopped fighting to remain in a life that had become unbearable. She was buried next to the unnamed infant in the Vanderhorn family cemetery. The Baron commissioned an elaborate headstone, white marble carved with angels and flowers, inscribed with, Margarita Vanderhorn, 1822–1851, beloved wife. Her gentle spirit has found peace. The hypocrisy of that inscription, beloved wife, was apparently lost on no one except the Baron himself. After Margarita's death, the Baron's social standing began a slow collapse. The scandal had never been officially acknowledged, but it had spread through Charleston society in whispers. Invitations to social events decreased. Business relationships soured. Other planters found reasons to avoid him. By 1852, the Baron was largely isolated, managing Ashbourne alone, rarely coming to Charleston except for necessary business. In 1853, apparently unable to tolerate solitude and perhaps genuinely believing he could restart his life, the Baron remarried. His second wife was an Elizabeth Hartwell, 22 years old, from a Virginia planter family that had fallen on hard times financially. The marriage was arranged through intermediaries. Anne's father needed money, the Baron offered a generous settlement, and Anne herself had little say in the matter, which was common for women of her time and class. They had no children. Whether this was because the Baron was indeed infertile as he had feared, or because Anne somehow prevented conception, or because their marriage was never consummated, or simply because conception didn't occur, the records don't say. What is recorded is that Anne spent most of her time in Charleston, maintaining a separate residence there, visiting Ashbourne only occasionally. The marriage was one in legal name only. The Baron lived at Ashbourne increasingly alone, managing the plantation with a series of overseers who never lasted long. Enslaved people who had been at Ashbourne during 1847–48 were gradually sold away. Whether because they knew too much or because the Baron couldn't bear their presence, the effect was the same. By 1860, almost none of the original population remained. When the Civil War came in 1861, Ashbourne Plantation continued operating, though with difficulty as young white men left for the Confederate Army and the labor force became harder to control. The Baron was too old to fight. He was 53 in 1861, and his health had been declining for years. The tremor in his hands had worsened. He suffered from severe headaches, digestive problems, and what contemporaries called melancholia. In 1865, as the war ended and Sherman's forces moved through South Carolina, Ashbourne Plantation was occupied by Union soldiers. The Baron remained in the main house, nominally protected by military order against looting or violence, though this protection was inconsistently enforced. On April 23, 1865, the Baron was found dead in his study. The Union medical examiner who investigated ruled it suicide, a single pistol shot to the head, the weapon found near the body, powder residue on the Baron's right hand. But the circumstances were ambiguous enough that some suspected murder. The enslaved people at Ashbourne, newly freed by Union occupation, offered no information either way. If they knew something, they weren't telling Union soldiers. The Baron's will, filed in Charleston, left Ashbourne to Aunt Elizabeth, who had remained in Virginia throughout the war. She never returned to South Carolina. She sold the plantation property through intermediaries in 1866 to a Baltimore investment company that planned to use it for cotton cultivation with free labor. That plan failed. The plantation was abandoned by 1868. Freed people who had once been enslaved there refused to work the land even for wages. They called it cursed, haunted by the 9 men who died there. White workers wouldn't stay either. The isolation, the atmosphere of the place, something kept driving them away. The main house stood empty for 3 years. On the night of March 13, 1871, exactly 23 years after the 9 men's execution, the house burned. The cause was never determined. No one lived within 3 miles of it. No lightning storms were reported that night. The fire was discovered only when neighbors saw smoke the next morning. By the time anyone reached Ashbourne, the main house was ash and chimney stacks. The fire had been so hot and complete that little remained except the foundation and some melted glass. Some people whispered it was divine justice. Others said freed people had burned it deliberately. Still others claimed it was simple accident, a vagrant's campfire, perhaps, or spontaneous combustion of old, dry wood. The property was eventually subdivided and sold in parcels through the 1880s and 1890s. Parts became private residences for people who knew nothing of the history. Parts remained undeveloped marshland. By 1900, no physical trace of the plantation's main buildings remained except some foundation stones and a few outbuildings that gradually rotted into the landscape. The Vanderhorn family cemetery, where Margarita and the infant were buried, was maintained sporadically until the 1920s, when the last Vanderhorn heir died without children and no one remained to care for it. The cemetery was gradually consumed by vegetation, the stones toppled or broken, the inscriptions worn away by weather and time. The 9 men's graves were never located. Multiple searches were conducted, in the 1930s by WPA historians documenting slavery's legacy, in the 1960s by civil rights activists trying to honor those who had resisted the system, in the 1990s by archaeologists from the University of South Carolina using ground-penetrating radar. The South Marsh boundary, where they were supposedly buried, had been altered by a century and a half of tidal changes, erosion, development, and natural processes. The marsh had shifted, grown, shrunk, been drained, and reflooded. Whatever markers existed, if any existed, were long gone. They remain lost. 9 men whose names are known, whose stories are recorded, but whose bodies were denied even the dignity of marked graves. But their testimony wasn't entirely erased, though the powerful tried. The story circulated for generations through black communities in South Carolina. It became part of the oral tradition, the teaching stories that elders told younger people about slavery's true nature. Some versions were more accurate than others. Some details changed or were elaborated, but the essential truth remained: 9 men were executed not for rebellion but for knowledge. They were executed for being witnesses, and they spent their last moments shouting that truth for everyone to hear, ensuring it couldn't be completely silenced. In 1889, 41 years after the events, a book was published in Boston titled Legal Anomalies and Suppressions in Antebellum South Carolina Courts. The author was listed as a Southern lawyer, anonymous, which was common for works that criticized Southern practices during this period of reconciliation between North and South. The book included a brief section about an 1848 case involving allegations of forced breeding practices on a Charleston area plantation. The account is only 3 paragraphs long, but it is remarkably accurate given that most records had been destroyed. It mentions a baron, 9 enslaved men, a hearing, and systematic efforts to suppress evidence. It concludes, records of this matter were deliberately destroyed or removed from archives. What remains suggests a systematic effort to eliminate evidence of crimes that threatened not just one planter's reputation but the fundamental pretenses upon which plantation society rested: that slavery was paternalistic, that white women were protected and honored, that the system had moral boundaries it would not cross, that there were lines even the most brutal masters would not transgress. This case proved those pretenses were lies, complete and absolute lies. It proved that slavery's essential logic, that humans could be property, that they could be owned and used without moral limitation, inevitably led to horrors that even slavery's defenders found difficult to justify. And so the case itself had to become a lie, had to be erased so thoroughly that even its erasure would be forgotten. But we must remember. We must bear witness to those who bore witness. The 9 men who died at Ashbourne in March 1848 deserve that much. The 9 men who died at Ashbourne on March 13, 1848, were Thomas Ridley, 28. Marcus Finch, 23. Isaiah Brennan, 31. Daniel Pute, 26. Jacob Worth, 22. Samuel Hoyt, 34. Levi Church, 29. Nathaniel Cross, 25. Robert Foster, 19. Their names appear in exactly 4 places now: the plantation ledgers where they were struck through in red ink on March 14, Edmund Berkeley's destroyed notes preserved in fragments by his widow, the testimony records that survived partial destruction in the 1854 fire, and in the memories of communities who refused to let them be forgotten. They were murdered for the crime of being witnesses. They were murdered for threatening to expose a horror that the system could not acknowledge without admitting its own complete moral bankruptcy. They were murdered because their testimony revealed that there was no bottom to slavery's depravity, no line that wouldn't be crossed, no human dignity that would be respected when it conflicted with a master's will or convenience. And they spent their last moments, those final minutes between the rope being prepared and the rope taking their lives, shouting truth that most people in power refused to hear but that could never be completely silenced. What do you think of this story? Does it make you question what other horrors were erased from historical records, disappeared from archives, struck from memory because they revealed too much about the systems that profited from them? How many other stories like this existed? Events so disturbing they had to be systematically destroyed. Witnesses who had to be silenced. Truths that had to be buried because acknowledging them would require acknowledging the full horror of what slavery actually was, not the sanitized version Southern society tried to preserve in its memory. Leave your comment below. If you found this story as disturbing and important as it deserves to be remembered, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and share this with someone who understands that the most terrifying stories are the ones that really happened. The ones powerful people tried to erase. The ones we have a duty to remember precisely because someone wanted them forgotten. See you in the next video.